if you were to go back just several years, it's unlikely that many evangelicals would actually be anticipating having to ask the question about civil disobedience. But looking at the present, and especially even the short and moderate term looking to the future, a good number of Christians are beginning to wonder, what do we do when the regime actually turns hostile to Christian conviction and even intrudes upon Christian and religious liberty? I think it's a very important question, good one for us to discuss, not just in hypothetical terms, but kind of putting ourselves on the line as to how we're actually thinking through these things, anticipating some very real challenges. Tim, where are you on this?
Well, the safe way of, academically, theoretically, you say, the safe way to say when do Christians have to do civil disobedience is when you're commanded to do something that the Bible forbids. So in China, if you say after you've had one child and you get pregnant again, you must have an abortion. That's a great textbook case almost for where Christians would say, I have to disobey the state. Because it's one, you could say we need to do civil disobedience to protest the legality of abortion in this country. And yet a person could come back and say, but the law is not forcing you to sin. It's allowing other people to sin, but it's not forcing you to sin. So should you do civil disobedience? And that's a debate. But there's no debate when it comes to the law actually enjoining what the Bible forbids or forbidding what the Bible enjoins. So you have, in Acts, when the apostles are told not to preach the gospel, they disobey the civil authorities by preaching the gospel. And if any part of what would be normal Christian teaching from the Bible would be deemed hate speech, illegal, that's when we'll have to disobey. So, and the prospects of that are not all that unlikely at this point.
Of the latter especially.
Yeah, that's right.
When Thoreau coined the term in 1848, obviously civil disobedience happened before then, but he coined the term in the sense that we use it. And since then it's taken on two levels of meaning. The first level is the refusal to obey a command or a law. And the second level is to claim that the regime is not legitimate.
Right.
Those are two different things.
Yes, they are.
And for instance, in the United States, I think the civil rights movement, central to that movement was the practice of civil disobedience at that first level. But Christians always have to acknowledge that second level does exist. The possibility of an idolatrous regime, the possibility of a regime that sets itself against or for, respectively, the things that the church cannot do, or to, as you say, enjoin us from doing those things that we must do.
Right.
I think the most difficult questions for most of us are going to be at that first level for at least some time. But Christians are beginning to ask questions such as, do I pay my taxes if certain laws come down the line? If there were to be, for instance, a law commanding that we would pay for abortifacient drugs in terms of insurance coverage, or furthermore, without previous legislative remedies, if we were to have to pay for through our taxes actually the performing of abortions, what would we do? Christians, I would argue, better be careful about conflating those two levels too quickly. In that, I would suggest that such a law would be that which a Christian could not accept. But to jump to the second of claiming the regime is not legitimate, that means it's no longer capable of correction. So I think we're going to have to really think through these things, because a lot of Christians are going to find ourselves, we should be right now, I would argue, in a position in which we find many practices and policies, laws of our government unacceptable, especially in terms of the bureaucratic regime. But we actually, we still obey the regime insofar as we take its general structure as being legitimate. Somewhere there's a tripwire there. John, you've just been through a situation with your church in which, standing for the faith, you have now suffered a judicial insult, to use the old language. You have, for standing for righteousness, now been required by the law to pay a very significant price. What does that feel like to be on that end? How does civil disobedience even function as a category in your experience?
Yes, well, we were in a position where we had to decide whether we were going to obey the hierarchies of our denomination, or we were going to take a step of leaving that denomination. And when we did that, they sued us for the property, and we had to decide whether we were going to submit ourselves to the legal process in the state of Virginia in order to come to a solution to that. And so we have been involved in litigation for 5 years, and what has happened recently is 4,000 people have been turned out of our church. Our property's been turned over to the denomination. Most of our funds have been drained and turned over to the denomination. Even my house has been taken. And I think what I've learned is that, if you are a biblically committed pastor and in somewhat of a high-profile situation, you don't expect either objective reporting in the media or sympathetic court rulings in the way that you might have assumed earlier. We elected to pursue appeal through the legal process and to see that through. And we've seen it through pretty much to the end now, and we lost, and so we've submitted that, and we've now moved out. And
can I try to put words in your mouth?
Yeah,
test something
sure.
here?
Yeah.
So in other words, you don't agree with the verdict of the court, or you wouldn't have gone to the court in the first place.
Right.
You were making a contrary argument. Your argument lost, even though I think you were right.
Right.
And you're accepting the verdict of the court in the sense that you're not arming your congregation to hold the building. On the other hand, if the court enjoined you from preaching the gospel, my guess is you're ready to go to jail. Is that distinction helpful?
The matter of property is a secondary issue, but when it comes to being obedient to the Lord Jesus, then you have a higher authority.
Yes.
And Caesar has his place, but Jesus has his place, and you have to make that choice.
Mm-hmm. So you're accepting Caesar's verdict on the property, but not on the gospel.
Our situation was that we fought this thing so long and in so many different ways, and the ruling was so decisively against us that we had to conclude that there was a bigger plan at work. We had prayed about it, we had worked, we had done all that we knew to do, and when we got such a decisive no, we didn't like it, but we decided, well, we're going to accept this as the will of God in this situation.
Tim, in terms of the powers that be, government is one that Christians in our time, our generation, have generally thought of as being a fairly benign reality. Amongst the many things we prayed for, protect us from the government has not been one of them until we can now envision where it might come into play. When would you tell your people, all right, here's the fire break. Here's where we simply can't go. We have been offended by many things in the past, but at this point, we're saying that we're willing to draw the line here. Is that something you kind of know? You spoke to this earlier, but in other words, where does that happen? Where do you see it? Where do you anticipate it would happen?
It's a little hard to predict. I mean, some of you know that the city of New York, unlike almost any other place I know in the country, has made a distinction between worship and speech. So what they've decided is that if you're a church and you're trying to rent a public school for worship, even though all these other groups can rent the school for a variety of reasons, and the city of New York said, "Oh, we're not against free speech." Of course, they couldn't have said that; they would have been shut down. But worship's different. Worship is something very different. They actually said, when you worship, it's not freedom of speech. It's you're essentially taking over the building and turning it into a sacred space, and that's mixing up church and state. It was a very, very strained argument. And yet I do know that when we knew some of the legislators and the people we had elected, city council and all that, when some of us went to these meetings and heard the hostile statements coming out of our elected officials toward evangelical churches, which they saw as very, very as an invasion of their place. It was, a lot of us went away shaken by that, suddenly saying, wait a minute, we're voters and we thought of ourselves as participants and co-citizens, and we go back and forth and we win some, we lose some, but we never felt that we were being targeted or that we really were seen as the enemy. I don't think that means yet civil disobedience. I don't think so. It does mean that yet. I mean, in some ways, I think we're supposed to be willing to suffer. It means being unpopular, and I'm still at the place where I think that it's when we are being commanded by the state to do something we're forbidden to do, or forbidden to do something we're commanded to do it. That's easy. I don't see before that. I guess I have a little bit of a temperament that says, I look at Romans. I look at Paul talking about obeying the state. It was a considerably more hostile state.
To say the least.
To say the least. Mm-hmm. So I think for Christians to get their backs up and start to make all sorts of incredible protests, we're just so freaked out and offended that they're no longer respecting us Christians anymore, and I think we have to avoid that.
Well, the reason I asked the question that way is because I want to warn Christians from drawing lines in the sand in anticipation and saying, if that happens, then we're out of the process. Yeah. Because, we have to go, indeed, from the early chapters of the book of Acts to Romans 13 and recognize that if the state says you can't preach the gospel, then I'm willing to say right now, that's the line. Yeah. If the church, if the state says you cannot gather together as a fellowship of believers, that's where, all right, we're ready to go to jail. But the problem with drawing policy issues as issues of declaring the regime to be illegitimate is that Romans 13 really doesn't give us a whole lot of ground for that. We're talking about Caesar, who claimed to be God. Yeah. And so what we have in Romans 13 is Paul saying, yes, but even then, in a fallen world, God has given government as an institution to uphold righteousness, to punish the evildoer, etc. So we need to stay in the process.
Right.
And so that's the encouragement I'm trying to give, is to say, because I hear conservative Christians who want to do the right thing who will say, if that happens, I can't go there. And the first thing I want to say is, well, you're more complicit with the regime right now than you think. I mean, right now, your taxes are paying for all kinds of things that you would find abhorrent if you actually follow those tax dollars. Now, I'm not saying you'd be satisfied with that. That's why you stay active in the political sphere as a citizen. But at the same time, if you're actually going to declare yourself the enemy of the regime, first of all, you better be ready for the regime to consider you an enemy. But you also better be sure it's actually for the cause of the gospel, and not something that we're going to put as a priority to make us an enemy of the state prior to that.
One of the things you have to do is, in a local community, you have to put yourself into the shoes of the local government. You have to try to hear what they're hearing, the complaints they're hearing, the needs they're hearing. Suppose we wanted to build a new church building, series of buildings, property, and the town fathers said, we're not going to give you permission to build this building until you include some businesses in your properties that will bring tax dollars. So you'll have to have room for shops in your church property and offices and things like that for the public. On the one hand, I would certainly resent them telling me what I needed to build for my church and what I didn't. But on the other hand, I think you'd have to listen to what their reasoning was and what their concerns were before you just get all high-handed about the fact that they no longer respect us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, and also there are generally legal maneuvers you can do to avoid that actually having to be on your property. Mm-hmm. There's sequestrations and other things that are possible.
But that's using the system.
Having a good, thoughtful analysis of such a thing is called for. We honor those three Hebrew young men who went into the fiery furnace. Mm-hmm. We're thankful for Daniel, who refused to bend the knee to the idol. And we know that we have to stand there too, just like the apostles before the Sanhedrin. At the same time, those were issues of idolatry. They were issues of being enjoined from preaching the gospel and naming the name of Jesus. And we know these other issues are so important. We really do. I want to be very clear. I believe these issues are extremely important. And there are acts of civil disobedience short of declaring yourself the enemy of the regime. And that's where, in the civil rights movement and in other things, you had people willing to make demonstrative actions to say, this is wrong, we want to draw your attention to it. We're willing to be arrested for this. And you'll notice that one of the things the civil rights leader said was, we are not rejecting the legitimacy of the regime. We want to influence the regime. We're willing to suffer for that, but we are not making ourselves the enemy of the regime, of the government.
Right, because in a sense, it's passive. It's just a way of, it wasn't attacking.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, when you deliberately are trying to attack and undermine, in some ways, to show, I remember I read a book on the theology of Martin Luther King Jr. a year or so ago, and it was very illuminating. He got the idea from Gandhi, of course, to some degree. I don't know to what degree he'd said that. Forgive me if I'm saying something that's unorthodox, but there's a sense in which that shows respect by being willing to let yourself be arrested. It shows respect, and yet a very, very forceful statement to the powers that be as well. You're not, frankly, getting out a gun and taking over a government building and demanding ransom or things like that. You're showing respect. At the same time, you're really calling on them to see illegitimacy of certain laws, but not the illegitimacy of the whole thing. Otherwise, you wouldn't turn yourself in. So I actually thought that was very important and intriguing to see. Right. Nevertheless, I'm not sure. In some ways, it can be overused too. I'm not sure that because the civil rights movement had such moral authority and power and success, there's an awful lot of other people wanting to use that sort of thing, protesting and getting arrested, and you do wonder. It may make you feel incredibly noble. It makes you wonder whether it's really all that effective.
Now, this also points out the difficulty in a Christian understanding of stating in advance how something might happen in any given political context, because the political contexts are so different. The political context of first century Rome was very different from the situation. Romans didn't have a participatory Republican system of government as we do. They did not have a representative system of government the same way we do. When you think of Caesar, part of the responsibility is, in one sense, we are at least partly Caesar, in that this government claims legitimacy from the people. We have a political activity as well. But to me, it seems the most important thing is to be willing to say in advance, I will preach the gospel, regardless of what that costs me. The church will continue to gather together for worship regardless of whether we get arrested for it or not. We'll continue to contend for righteousness, and we'll suffer for that if necessary. But at the end of the day, we can make this an issue short of the preaching of the gospel or short of required idolatry, in which we're actually giving, I think, the state too much authority, allowing it to set too much of the agenda.
There's something I want to say. Culture is certainly changing, and biblical Christians are feeling themselves not as well understood, not as well accepted. The climate is changing. We all feel it. As we face more opposition through the culture or even from our own government, I think one thing that does is it clarifies our thinking about what really matters and what doesn't matter. And it forces us to think about what is the role of church in society. And well, let's face it, we've been pretty superficial in our faith for a long time here in the American church. And as we face opposition, it's going to cause us to begin to think more seriously about our faith. And I think it gives us a deeper sense of awareness of the Christians around the world who are truly persecuted for the hard things that they endure. And I must say, when the judge's ruling came down and he said, all your money, all your buildings, they're gone, there was something in me that said, wow, maybe I am a Christian after all. I mean, there's something about identifying with that sense of opposition that might be good for us.
Yes.
I believe the church must stand with the unborn. I believe the church must stand for marriage. I believe that even insofar as the state itself makes itself complicit in what we believe is horrible sin, we need to contend against it with every ounce of our being, as citizens, first of all, as Christian citizens. But at the end of the day, those things still going against us, we have the responsibility to teach and preach the gospel, so long as there's life and breath in us. And so long as we understand, there could be a penalty for that, but that's still what we're called to do.